The sound wasn't a slam. It was a low, expensive whir. The electric blinds descended over the floor-to-ceiling glass, slicing away the chaotic sprawl of the city below until we were left in a twilight of our own making. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, architectural, a physical weight pressing against the sudden intimacy of the room. I had walked into this office 40 minutes ago, desperate to secure the promotion that would define my career. But as the light vanished, I realized I wasn't here to negotiate a salary. I was about to learn the difference between merely playing the part and actually owning the room. The building itself was designed to intimidate, a monolith of steel and glass piercing the low cloud layer, demanding perfection from anyone brave enough to step through its revolving doors. I arrived 20 minutes early, clutching a leather portfolio that cost more than my first car, my knuckles white against the handle. The lobby was a cathedral of capitalism, vast and echoing, where the sound of my sensible heels clicking on the polished marble sounded like a countdown. I was the newcomer here, the rigorous candidate, the one who had studied every annual report and memorized every shareholder grievance. My suit was tailored, sharp, intended to be armor against the corporate wolves I knew waited on the executive floor. But standing in that cavernous space, checking my reflection in the brass of the security turnstile, that armor felt dangerously thin. I was over-prepared, armed with statistics and projections. Yet, beneath the starch of my collar, my pulse was a frantic, erratic drumbeat. I wanted to please. I wanted to be the perfect cog in this impossible machine. The elevator ride was a solitary confinement of rising pressure. Floor 10. Floor 20. My ears popped, a physical reminder of the altitude I was ascending to. I rehearsed my opening line for the third time, smoothing a non-existent crease on my skirt, checking my teeth in the mirrored walls. I prepared myself for an older man, perhaps, or a committee of skeptics. I prepared for questions about quarterly targets and efficiency models. I did not prepare for the doors to slide open on the 50th floor and reveal her, Lillian. She stood in the center of the reception atrium, not behind a desk, but waiting. She held a tablet in one hand, not like a tool, but like a weapon she hadn't decided to use yet. She wasn't what I expected. She wore a suit, but cut in a way that suggested the rules didn't quite apply to her. Sharp lapels, a silk blouse in a shade of deep oxblood that looked like a bruise against the sterile white of the room. The air in the elevator car seemed to compress the moment our eyes met, charged with a sudden, static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. She moved with a fluid, calculated grace, turning slightly as the chime announced my arrival. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't offer the polite, hollow smile of a corporate gatekeeper. Instead, her gaze swept over me, starting at my shoes and traveling up to my anxious eyes. It wasn't a look of judgment. It was a dismantling. In 3 seconds, she stripped away the rehearsed introduction, the carefully constructed persona of the competent professional, and saw the trembling ambition underneath. "You're early," she said finally. Her voice was low, a rich contralto that seemed to vibrate in the small space between us. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact that somehow made my punctuality feel like a desperate overreach. I stepped out of the safety of the lift, the doors closing behind me with a soft whoosh, sealing off my escape. I wanted to be prepared, I managed, my voice sounding thinner than I liked. She turned, the silk of her blouse catching the light, and the scent hit me, something complex, like sandalwood and rain on hot pavement. "Preparation is fine," she murmured, tapping the screen of her tablet without looking down. "But desperation smells distinct, even under expensive perfume." She looked up again, her eyes dark and unreadable, holding mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. And you are radiating it. The atmosphere grew dense, loaded with unspoken intent. I felt a flush rise from my neck, a mix of shame and a strange, sharp intrigue. This wasn't the interview I had practiced for. This was something else entirely. She gestured toward the double doors behind her, her movement languid yet commanding. "Walk with me," she said. It wasn't an invitation. It was the first rule being written in real time. The executive floor was a different ecosystem entirely, one where the oxygen seemed thinner, and the silence was a commodity that had been purchased at a premium. Here, the frantic energy of the lobby below was filtered out, replaced by a hush that felt heavy, architectural. The carpet was plush enough to swallow the sound of my footsteps, disrupting my rhythm, making me feel unmoored. I followed Lillian down the corridor, watching the way she moved. There was no wasted energy in her stride, no hesitation. She walked like she owned the very air we were breathing, and perhaps, up here, she did. We passed offices with frosted glass walls, vague silhouettes of power moving behind them, until we reached the nerve center at the end of the hall. Her desk was a fortress of obsidian and chrome, positioned strategically to guard the double mahogany doors that led to the CEO's sanctuary. It was immaculate. No stray papers, no personal photos, no clutter. Just the sleek surface of technology and a single, heavy fountain pen. She moved behind it, reclaiming her territory, and suddenly the distance between us felt vast. I stood on the other side, clutching my portfolio, feeling like a petitioner at the gates of some silent, demanding deity. I tried to engage the mask I had perfected over 5 years of mid-level management. The pleasant, non-threatening professional. "It really is a beautiful building," I said, my voice pitching slightly too high, trying to fill the oppressive quiet with standard corporate pleasantries. The view from the elevator was... Lillian didn't even look up. She was tapping something into her console, her eyes focused on the screen with an intensity that suggested I had ceased to exist the moment I stopped moving. My words withered in the air, dying a quick, embarrassing death. The quiet deepened, pressing against my eardrums. I shifted my weight, the leather of my portfolio creaking in my grip. I needed to do something, to prove I belonged here. I reached into my bag and pulled out the dossier I had prepared. The quarterly analysis, the projection models, the reasons why I was the only logical choice for the role. "I have the files for the meeting," I said, stepping forward. I extended the folder across the desk. My hand, usually steady, betrayed me. A microscopic tremor ran through my fingers, vibrating the stiff cardstock. It was fear, raw and undeniable. Lillian stopped typing. She didn't take the file. Instead, her eyes locked onto my trembling hand. She watched it for a long beat, her expression unreadable, before her gaze traveled slowly up my arm to my face. "Look at that," she said softly. It wasn't a question. I had a lot of coffee," I lied, the excuse tasting like ash. "No," she corrected, her voice dropping an octave, intimate and unflinching. She stood up and walked around the desk, invading my personal space with a deliberate slowness that made my heart hammer against my ribs. She stopped inches from me, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her. She reached out, but she didn't take the folder. She placed her hand over mine, her fingers cool and firm, pressing down until the shaking stopped. The contact was electric, grounding, and terrifying. "Rule 1, she whispered, the words brushing against my skin. "Precision. You are handing me your worth, not a takeout menu. If you offer it with a tremor, You are telling me you don't believe you deserve to be holding it." She held my gaze, her thumb brushing the side of my hand, a touch that was technically corrective but felt dangerously possessive. "Take it back. Do it again. And this time, don't ask for permission." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I pulled the folder back, took a breath that I forced into my diaphragm, and extended it again. I focused on the stillness, on the weight of her attention. This time, my hand was steady. She took it, her fingers grazing mine, the friction lingering longer than necessary. "Better," she murmured, stepping back but not looking away. She leaned against the edge of her desk, crossing her arms. "You check your reflection in every surface you pass. You hold your breath before you speak, hoping the silence will give you an opening. You are terrified of taking up space." I felt the blood drain from my face. I thought I had been careful. I thought my suit was armor, but she had seen through the wool and the silk to the nervous, hungry thing underneath. It was a violation, but it was also the most seen I had ever felt. "The CEO is delayed," she said abruptly, breaking the spell. She checked her watch, dismissing the moment as if it hadn't just dismantled me. "Tokyo markets are volatile. He won't be here for 3 hours. She looked up, a challenge curling the corner of her mouth. "Which means you have 3 hours to learn how to stop shaking." The transition from the open expanse of the executive floor to the records room was abrupt. It felt like stepping from a showroom into the engine block. The air here was still, preserved, smelling faintly of ozone and aging paper. The lighting was motion-activated, flickering on in banks of fluorescent hums as we walked deeper into the stacks. It felt less like an office, and much more like a vault. Lillian moved through the narrow aisles with that same unnerving grace, her heels silent on the industrial carpet. I followed, feeling too large, too loud, my portfolio bumping against the metal shelving with a hollow clang that made me wince. We were looking for the 98 acquisition files, physical copies that hadn't been digitized. "Aisle 4, she said, her voice absorbed by the rows of cardboard boxes. I moved to help, eager to demonstrate my utility. I scanned the labels frantically, my fingers hovering over the spines of binders. I wanted to find it first. I wanted to show her I could be efficient, that I didn't waste time. I spotted the year, grabbed the heavy binder, and pulled it free, turning too quickly. "Got it," I said, breathless. Lillian was standing right there. I hadn't heard her approach. In my haste, I nearly collided with her. I froze, the binder clutched to my chest. "Oh, sorry," I blurted out, stepping back, shrinking into the shelf behind me to give her room. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to be quick." Lillian didn't move back. She stood her ground, blocking the exit of the aisle. The space between the shelves was claustrophobic, barely wide enough for 2 people, and she was occupying the center of it. She looked at the binder in my arms, then up at my face. She reached out, not for the binder, but past me. Her arm brushed against the sleeve of my jacket, a friction that sent a shockwave through my nervous system. She was reaching for a box on the shelf behind my head. To do it, she had to lean in. The proximity was suffocating and intoxicating. I was pressed against the metal shelving, the cold steel biting into my back, while the front of my body was inches from the silk of her blouse. I could feel the heat radiating from her, a physical warmth that mocked the cool temperature of the room. I held my breath, terrified that if I exhaled, my chest would brush against hers. I could see the fine grain of her skin, the way her eyelashes caught the fluorescent light. She paused there, her hand resting on the box above my shoulder, trapping me. She wasn't looking at the box. She was looking at me. "You apologized," she said, her voice a low murmur, vibrating in the small space between us. "I was in your way," I whispered. "No," she corrected, her eyes darkening. "You were occupying space. There is a difference." She leaned in a fraction closer, and my pulse spiked against my ribs. You shrink to fit the room. You slide sideways. You apologize for existing in a place that wasn't built for you. If you want to sit at that table out there, you have to unlearn that. Never apologize for taking up space. Make them walk around you. She held my gaze for a second longer, letting the lesson sink in, letting the tension coil tight enough to snap. Then, with agonizing slowness, she pulled the box down and stepped back. The air rushed back into the aisle, cool and shockingly empty. "Bring the binder," she said, turning her back on me and walking toward the exit. "We have reading to do." I stood there for a moment, clutching the heavy file, my legs shaking. In this narrow, silent room, there was nowhere to hide. I pushed off the shelf, took a breath, and didn't apologize to the empty air. I just followed her out, the quiet sitting heavy between us. The main boardroom was a cavernous expanse of acoustic perfection, a chamber designed to amplify power and swallow weakness. It was dominated by a table that seemed to stretch for miles, a single, seamless slab of dark mahogany polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the recessed lighting overhead like a frozen black lake. The walls were glass on three sides, offering a panoramic view of the city that reduced the millions of lives below to abstract geometry. We entered this sanctuary of decision-making, and the heavy doors clicked shut behind us, sealing the room in a pressurized hush. Lillian didn't take the seat at the head of the table. She chose the chair immediately to its right, the position of the whisperer, the kingmaker. She gestured for me to sit. I took the chair opposite her, the width of the table creating a physical canyon between us. We were waiting for the call, the digital chime that would announce the CEO's presence, but the screens on the wall remained dark. There was only the low, ambient hum of the building's life support systems and the sound of my own shallow breathing. The stillness expanded. It wasn't passive, it was active, a living thing that filled the room. I had been trained that silence in a business setting was a vacuum that needed to be filled, a sign of disengagement or, worse, incompetence. I watched Lillian. She was perfectly still, her hands resting loosely on the table, her eyes fixed on the middle distance. She looked like a statue, carved from confidence. I, on the other hand, felt the itch of the quiet crawling under my skin. I needed to prove I was present. I needed to show I was thinking. "The market volatility," I started, my voice sounding startlingly loud in the acoustic isolation. I cleared my throat, hating the sound. I was reading that the merger implications for the Asian sector might be more complex than the initial risk assessment suggested. If we look at the dash, I stopped. Lillian hadn't spoken, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto mine. It wasn't angry, it was bored. And that was infinitely worse. "I just meant," I stammered, the silence now feeling like a trap I had walked into, "that we should be ready with a counter strategy if the—" Lillian reached for the crystal pitcher in the center of the table. She poured a glass of water, the liquid glugging softly, the only real sound in the world. She didn't drink it. Instead, she placed her fingers on the base of the coasterless glass and pushed. It slid across the polished mahogany with a quiet, steady hiss, traversing the distance between us with impossible smoothness. It stopped perfectly at the edge of the table, directly in front of my chest. "Drink," she said. Her voice was calm, devoid of inflection. "You are parched from talking." I reached for the glass. My hand was steady this time, but my mind was reeling. I took a sip. The water was shockingly cold. "Now," she whispered, her voice carrying effortlessly across the table. "Just look at me. Don't speak. Don't look at your notes. Just hold it." I lowered the glass. I wanted to look away. The intensity of her gaze was physically heavy, a weight pressing on my chest. Every instinct I had screamed to break the contact, to look at the view, to check my phone, to smile, anything to diffuse the tension. But I didn't. I forced my chin to stay level. I locked my eyes on hers. The seconds ticked by, agonizingly slow. I felt exposed, stripped of my professional armor. She was seeing the ambition, the fear, and something else. The heat rising in my blood that had nothing to do with the merger. But as I held her gaze, the panic began to recede, replaced by a strange, focused clarity. I wasn't submitting to the silence anymore. I was inhabiting it with her. The desire to please her was mutating, hardening into a desire to impress her. Outside, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long orange shadows across the polished wood, turning the space between us into a landscape of fire and darkness. We sat in the twilight, neither of us speaking, the connection between us tightening like a wire, humming with a frequency that felt dangerous. The sun had fully retreated. The silence of the boardroom was broken by the buzz of Lillian's phone, a reminder, not a summons. The CEO was still delayed, caught in the gravity of international finance, but the gala downstairs, a networking minefield of investors, competitors, and sharks in tuxedos, was starting. "We need to make an appearance," she said, standing up. The shift was instantaneous. The predator in the boardroom, the one who weaponized silence, became the diplomat. We moved to the executive lounge, a space of dark wood, low light, and expensive scotch, ostensibly to freshen up before descending into the fray. I watched her in the reflection of the floor-to-ceiling window. She didn't retreat to the brightly lit sanitary safety of the restroom. She stood right there against the skyline, applying a fresh coat of dark lipstick. It was a private act, performed with public confidence. She didn't open her mouth wide or stretch her face into the awkward shapes we all make when we think no one is watching. She applied the color with a few precise, devastating strokes, pressing her lips together with a sound that was barely there, but somehow echoed in the hollow of my chest. She was unflinching, even to her own reflection. I, meanwhile, was unraveling. I retreated to the mirror above the wet bar, frantically trying to salvage my appearance. My hair felt flat, the humidity of the archives having done its work. My lipstick had faded to a nervous, bitten stain, and my blouse felt like it was strangling me. I tugged at my collar, smoothed my skirt with damp palms, and reapplied powder in a cloud of anxiety. I looked like someone trying to look like they belonged, which is the surest sign that they don't. I was adjusting my blazer for the 10th time when the reflection changed. "Stop!" Lillian's voice cut through my panic, sharp and clean. I froze, a tube of mascara hovering near my eye. She walked over, not to the mirror, but to me. She stood behind me, her eyes meeting mine in the glass. The contrast was brutal. She was at ease, a dark orchid in a field of weeds, while I was vibrating with a frequency of pure tension. "You're fidgeting," she said, her voice low. "You're trying to fix things that aren't broken, because you think you are the error in the equation." She reached out. I stopped breathing. Her hands, cool and steady, moved to my neck. She didn't adjust my collar. She touched the skin just above it. Her knuckles grazed the pulse point under my jaw, a touch so light it felt phantom, yet it sent a jolt of electricity straight down my spine that made my knees weak. It was deliberate. It was possessive. It was a claim. "Rule 3, she murmured, her breath ghosting against my ear as she leaned in, her body heat radiating against my back. "Presentation. You think it's about the suit, the brand, the perfect hair. It isn't. It's about how comfortable you are in the skin underneath the silk. Her fingers trailed down to my collarbone, resting there, grounding me, forcing my shoulders to drop from their defensive hike. If you wear the suit like a costume, they will treat you like an actor. If you wear it like a second skin, they will treat you like the lead. Stop fixing it. Own it. I stared at our reflection. Her hands on my neck looked natural, right. My eyes were wide, pupils blown, lips parted slightly. I didn't look like a nervous assistant anymore. I looked like someone who had just been awakened. The panic was gone, replaced by a thrumming awareness of her proximity. Better, she whispered, satisfied. She stepped back, the loss of her touch leaving a cold spot on my skin that ached. She adjusted her own cuff, a flash of gold at her wrist catching the light. I had to teach this to Marcus before he made VP. He was just as twitchy. The name hit me like a splash of ice water. Marcus, the VP of sales. A man known for his ruthless charm and rapid ascent. The idea that she had stood behind him, touched his neck, taught him how to breathe. A spike of jealousy, sharp and hot, pierced through my anxiety. It wasn't professional envy. It was something far more dangerous. I didn't want to be another project. I wanted to be the exception. Marcus? I asked, my voice tighter than I intended, the word tasting sour. Lillian paused, catching the edge in my tone. She turned, a slow, knowing smile spreading across her lips. It was a smile that acknowledged the monster she was waking up inside me. Marcus was a good student, she said, moving toward the door, her silhouette cutting a sharp line against the city lights. But he lacked imagination. We descended, we survived, and we returned. The gala was a blur, but I moved through it with the ghost of her hand still burning on my neck. When the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, we took the elevator back up to the 50th floor, leaving the noise behind, the building emptying out until it was just the two of us again. The executive lounge was a study in shadows and expensive silence. The only light came from the panoramic window and the faint, clinical blue glow of the espresso machine in the corner. The air up here was different now. It wasn't the pressurized vacuum of the boardroom or the dusty stillness of the archives. It was intimate, heavy with the phantom rhythms of the music we had just left downstairs, and the scent of ozone and cooling electronics. I leaned against the cold marble counter, the adrenaline of the gala finally draining out of my heels, leaving a hollow ache in my calves and a buzzing fatigue behind my eyes. I let my posture slip, just a fraction. My shoulders rounded, my head tipped back, and I let out a breath that was less a sigh and more of a surrender. For the first time all day, I wasn't holding my stomach in. I wasn't projecting competence. I was just tired. The machine hissed, a violent burst of steam that shattered the quiet, startling me. I reached for a packet of sugar. Habit, comfort. A small hit of sweetness to offset the bitterness of the hour. Why do you want it? Lillian's voice came from the shadows near the doorway. She hadn't moved to get coffee. She was watching me, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, the silk of her blouse rippling like dark water in the dim light. I stirred the sugar in, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. The senior analyst position? I recited the answer I had memorized, the one I had polished in the mirror this morning. Because I believe my background in quantitative risk assessment aligns with the company's strategic goals for Q3 and— Stop, she said. She didn't raise her voice, but the word landed with the weight of a gavel. She pushed off the wall and walked toward me, her steps silent on the plush rug. The script is boring, and you are too tired to lie effectively. Look at you. You're exhausted from pretending to be someone who fits in a box that is too small for you. She stopped at the counter, hip resting against the marble, close enough that I could smell the faint smoke of the gala still clinging to her hair, mixed with that sharp, clean scent of rain. She looked at the cup in my hand, pale, milky, safe. "Tell me the truth," she demanded, her eyes dark and searching, stripping me bare. Not the HR answer, the real one. "Why are you here at 10 p.m., fighting for a job that will work you into the ground?" I looked down at the swirling coffee. The exhaustion stripped away my filter. The anger I had been suppressing for 5 years. The frustration of being the diligent, invisible worker bee suddenly bubbled up like bile. "Because I did everything right," I said, my voice low, surprising myself with its bitterness. "I followed every rule. I stayed late. I fixed the mistakes the VPs made. I was polite. I was grateful. And I watched mediocre men with half my talent fail upward while I was told to wait my turn." I looked up, meeting her gaze, the heat rising in my chest. "I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of being the good employee. I want the power to stop asking for permission." Lillian didn't smile, but her eyes flared. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The mentor was gone. Something predatory, something ancient and hungry took her place. She reached out and took the cup from my hand. I didn't stop her. "Good," she whispered. She poured my coffee, my sweet, safe, milky shield, into the sink. The liquid swirled down the drain, wasted. "That," she said, nodding at the sink, "is comfort. It's sugar to help the medicine go down. It's for children." She turned back to the machine, her movements sharp, efficient. She pulled a double shot of espresso, black, dark as oil. The smell was intense, acrid, and rich. She slid the small ceramic cup across the marble. It stopped inches from my hand. "Drink," she commanded. "No sugar, no cream. Taste the burn. If you want power, you have to learn to enjoy the bitterness. You have to stop trying to make it palatable." I looked at the black liquid. I looked at her. Her gaze was a challenge, a dare. I picked up the cup and drank. It was hot, shocking, and incredibly bitter. It woke up every nerve ending in my body. I didn't flinch. I swallowed it down and set the cup back on the saucer with a sharp click. "I'm awake," I said, my voice steady. Lillian smiled then, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips. She leaned in, invading my space, trapping me against the counter. Her hand came up to rest on the marble beside my hip, boxing me in. "Finally," she murmured. "The girl is gone. I was wondering when the woman would show up." Before I could answer, before the tension could snap into something physical, the phone on the wall chirped. A single, piercing ring. Lillian didn't look away from me as she reached back blindly and answered it. "Yes," she said, her eyes still locked on my mouth. She listened for a moment. "Understood." She hung up. The silence returned, heavier, charged with a new, terrifying potential. "The CEO," she said softly. "He's not coming. The meeting is canceled." She took a step closer, her knee brushing mine. "It's just us." The silence that followed the call was deceptive. A deep breath before the plunge. It didn't last. The tablet on the desk lit up with a notification, a harsh red bar cutting through the dim intimacy of the room. A crisis. The merger in Tokyo, the crown jewel of the quarter, the reason for the gala, the reason for the existence of this entire floor, was hemorrhaging. A leak in the press, a wobble in the stock price, a sudden coldness from the regulatory board. The details didn't matter as much as the deadline. We had until the markets opened in Japan to rewrite the entire proposal, or the deal was dead. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The predatory stillness vanished, replaced by a kinetic, frantic energy. We didn't speak about the shift. We just moved. We abandoned the lounge and returned to the main desk, turning the obsidian fortress into a war room. The lights were brought up to a low, working hum. Jackets were discarded on the backs of chairs. The perfect, polished armor we had worn all day was dismantled piece by piece. I rolled up the sleeves of my blouse. Lillian undid the top button of her silk shirt, a concession to the heat that was already beginning to rise in the room. For the next 4 hours, we didn't stop. It was a pressure cooker of high-stakes problem-solving, a blur of typing, printing, and redlining documents. We worked side by side, our chairs pulled close together, the physical boundaries between us dissolving in the urgency of the moment. We passed papers back and forth with a rhythm that felt rehearsed, a silent dance of efficiency. I would finish a paragraph, slide it to her. She would slash through a sentence with her fountain pen, rewrite it in the margins, and slide it back. The air in the room grew heavy, not just with the impending deadline, but with the friction of our minds grinding against each other. It was intellectual combat, and it was intoxicating. The smell of the rain hitting the floor-to-ceiling glass intensified, mixing with the metallic hum of the server room and the hint of her perfume, sharp and clean, which seemed to bloom in the heat of the work. Then came the snag. Clause 14, the risk mitigation strategy. "It's too aggressive," Lillian said, her voice rough with fatigue. She tapped the paper with her pen. "We need to hedge here. If we expose the capital reserves, the board will balk. We cut the offer by 10%. I looked at the numbers. I looked at the psychology of the deal. My brain was firing on all cylinders, fueled by the bitter espresso and the adrenaline of her proximity. I saw the pattern she was missing. "No," I said. Lillian stopped writing. She turned her head slowly, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" "If we cut the offer, we look weak," I said, my voice rising, filling the room. "They're already spooked. If we hedge now, they'll think we're hiding insolvency. We don't cut. We double down. We offer the full reserve as a guarantee. We show them we're unflinching." "It's reckless," Lillian snapped, turning fully toward me. "It's gambling with the company's liquidity. It's not gambling if you know you're going to win." I slammed my hand down on the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the large room. I stood up, leaning over her, invading her space, my hands planted on the leather surface of the desk. "You told me to stop asking for permission. You told me to own the room. Well, I'm owning it. This is the strategy. It's the only way we survive the morning. If you want to play it safe, call Marcus. If you want to close this deal, you listen to me." My chest was heaving. My hair had come loose from its pin falling across my face. I stared down at her, terrified and exhilaratingly alive. I had just yelled at the gatekeeper. I had just challenged the power structure. Lillian didn't yell back. She didn't fire me. She looked up at me, her dark eyes wide, reflecting the city lights. Slowly, a smile spread across her face. Not the polite smile of the gala, or the predatory smile of the lounge. It was a smile of genuine, impressed recognition. "Finally," she breathed, the words soft but heavy. "You stopped asking for permission." She looked at the paper, then back at me. "Do it. Write it your way." I sat back down, my hands shaking. Not from fear, but from the sheer rush of the power exchange. We worked in a fugue state after that, the tension between us taut as a violin string. I wasn't working for the CEO anymore. I didn't care about the board or the stock price. I was working to prove myself to her. I was writing the proposal to keep that look in her eyes. By 2 a.m., it was done. The file was sent. The crisis was averted. The silence rushed back into the room, louder than before, heavy with the weight of what we had just shared. We sat there, in the dim light, the adrenaline fading, leaving only the raw, exposed reality of us. The upload bar hit 100%, a silent green flash that signaled the end of the war. The Tokyo deal was secure. The adrenaline that had sustained us, that had turned the last 4 hours into a blur of synchronized intellect and rapid-fire typing, began to recede. But it didn't leave a vacuum in its wake. It left something far more volatile. The professional pretext was gone. The deadline, which had acted as a buffer, a justifiable reason for our intense proximity, had evaporated into the digital ether. Now, there was just the room, the relentless rain, and the terrifying magnetic pull that had been building since the elevator doors slid open 12 hours ago. I slumped back in my chair, the leather creaking beneath me, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. My hands were still resting on the desk, fingers twitching slightly from the phantom rhythm of the keyboard. I looked at Lillian. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was staring at the rain streaking the black glass, her profile sharp and unreadable against the city lights. She looked like a general who had won the battle, but was already planning the occupation of the territory. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up. She didn't offer a congratulatory word. She didn't suggest we call a car. She walked past the desk, her movement fluid, the silk of her blouse catching the low light of the desk lamp. She moved to the wall panel near the entrance and pressed a single button. The heavy blackout blinds began to descend, slicing away the skyline, inch by inch. When the bottom rail hit the sill with a soft thud, the room was sealed. We were no longer in a skyscraper. We were in a capsule, suspended in a void of our own making. Lillian didn't stop there. She turned from the panel and walked to the heavy double mahogany doors, the only exit. I watched her, my pulse restarting its rapid cadence, a different rhythm now, heavy and low in my stomach. She reached out, her hand pale against the dark wood, and turned the brass thumb turn. Click. The sound was small, but in the acoustic perfection of the office, it echoed like a gunshot. It was final. It was a boundary being drawn, not to keep people out, but to keep us in. She turned around. The distance between the door and the desk felt like a stage, and she was crossing it with the intent of a predator who has stopped stalking and decided to strike. She didn't return to her chair. She walked around the edge of the desk, entering my territory, collapsing the safe distance I had tried to maintain all night. "The proposal is filed," she said, her voice dropping that octave again, stripping away the corporate cadence. "The board is satisfied. The crisis is over." She stopped 2 feet from my chair, towering over me, her hands resting on her hips, pushing the jacket back to reveal the curve of her waist. "So we are done with business. We are done with the merger. We are done with the excuses." I swallowed, my throat dry. I should probably go," I stammered, the lie tasting weak on my tongue. "It's late and—" "Stop," she cut in. She leaned forward, placing her hands on the armrests of my chair, trapping me in a cage of her own making. Her face was inches from mine. I could see the dilation of her pupils, the faint flush of exertion high on her cheekbones. "You aren't leaving. Not yet." She tilted her head, studying me with that dismantling gaze. "In the elevator," she started, her voice a soft, dangerous purr. "When you walked in, you weren't looking at my tablet. You weren't looking at my shoes. You weren't checking your reflection. I tried to look away, to find a safe point in the room, but the blinds had taken them all. There was only her. "Tell me," she demanded, her breath ghosting against my lips. "What were you looking at?" "I was intimidated," I whispered, trying to deflect, trying to pull the armor of the nervous applicant back around me. "You scared me." "That's a lie," she countered instantly. "Fear makes you shrink. Fear makes you look for the exit. You didn't look for the exit. You looked at my mouth. You looked at my hands. You looked at the way my shirt fits." She moved one hand from the armrest to my knee. The heat of her palm seared through the fabric of my skirt. My breath hitched, a ragged sound that betrayed everything I was trying to hide. "I know what ambition looks like," she murmured, her thumb tracing a slow, deliberate circle on the inside of my knee. "I know the hunger for a job. I see it every day. This? She gestured between us with her free hand, the movement sharp. This is a different kind of hunger. You didn't challenge me on the proposal because you wanted to save the deal. You challenged me because you wanted to see if I could handle you. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated in my bones. Stop hiding. Stop pretending you're just here to be a good little assistant. You want something else. Admit it. My defenses, already battered by the long night, by the adrenaline, by the sheer force of her presence, finally crumbled. The mask of the professional slipped, shattering on the floor. I looked up at her, my eyes wide, stripping away the deference. I wasn't looking at the tablet, I admitted, my voice trembling, but not with fear. I was looking at you. The admission hung in the air, heavier than the silence, sharper than the rain hitting the glass. It wasn't just a confession of attraction. It was the dismantling of the firewall I had meticulously maintained for 5 years. My voice hadn't cracked, but the truth it carried felt fragile, dangerous. I haven't just been nervous about the interview, I continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. I stepped closer, invading the space she had claimed, my heart hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with market volatility. I've been terrified, not of the work. I can do the work. I was terrified of this, of the way you look at me, of the fact that, for the first time in my career, the separation between who I am and what I do is dissolving. I took a breath, the air thick with the scent of her and the ozone of the storm. I've spent my entire adult life keeping my ambition in one box and my desires in another. Being the good employee meant being devoid of want, devoid of messy, complicated hunger. But I look at you, and I don't want to be a good employee. I want to be present. I want what you have. And I want you. It was the first time I had voiced my bisexuality, my desire, in a space built for commerce and control. It felt like standing naked in the boardroom. I waited for her to shut me down, to tell me I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, to escort me out of the capsule we had built. Lillian didn't move. She didn't blink. She watched me with that same intense, dismantling gaze, but the predator's edge had softened into something validating. She didn't gloat over my surrender. She didn't smile with triumph. She simply nodded, accepting the offering. Good, she said, her voice low, a rumble that I felt in the soles of my feet. She leaned back against the edge of the obsidian desk, her hands gripping the polished edge, anchoring herself. You finally stopped lying to the one person who matters. She tilted her chin up, exposing the line of her throat, a challenge and an invitation wrapped in silk. Now choose. You can walk out that door, go back to the lobby, and be safe. Or you can stop waiting for permission. The choice hung between us. For hours, I had followed her lead. I had let her set the pace, the rules, the temperature of the room. But she wasn't leading now. She was waiting. I stopped thinking. I stopped analyzing the risk. I crossed the remaining distance in 2 strides. I didn't ask. I didn't hesitate. I reached out and grabbed the lapels of her oxblood blazer, the silk cool under my sweating palms, and I pulled her to me. I kissed her. It wasn't a polite, testing kiss. It was a collision. It was the taste of bitter espresso and hours of suppressed tension finally finding a release valve. I felt her gasp against my mouth, a sharp intake of breath that told me I had surprised her, that I had finally, truly impressed her. Her hands came up, not to push me away, but to tangle in my hair, pulling me closer, deepening the contact until the world narrowed down to the friction of our lips and the heat of our bodies. I pressed her back. She went willingly, her back hitting the desk, her weight shifting the piles of paper we had spent the night agonizing over. The merger proposal, the risk assessments, the millions of dollars in potential revenue. They slid off the smooth surface, scattering across the floor in a chaotic white fan. Neither of us looked down. The encounter was slow, focused entirely on the release of control. It was about the texture of skin, the softness of her cheek, the tension in her jaw, the warmth radiating through the layers of our corporate armor. My hands roamed over her, learning the geography of her power, finding the places where she wasn't a gatekeeper, but a woman who wanted to be touched. She made a sound, a low, ragged noise in her throat, when my thumb brushed her lower lip. And that sound shattered the last of my restraint. We moved together against the hard, unforgiving edge of the desk, a contrast of soft skin and cold glass, of professional setting and primal intent. I realized then, as her breath hitched in time with mine, that vulnerability wasn't a weakness to be hidden in a file. It was the ultimate leverage. By showing her my hunger, I hadn't given her a weapon. I had given us both a key. The intensity peaked, a wave that crashed over us, leaving us breathless, forehead to forehead, in the dim, rain-streaked light. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was sated. It was the quiet of a storm that had finally, beautifully, broken. Dawn didn't break over the city so much as it infiltrated the room. The light bled through the cracks between the heavy blinds, turning the absolute darkness of our capsule into a bruised slate gray. The storm had passed, leaving the sky outside exhausted and pale. But inside, the air remained charged, heavy with the scent of ozone, cooled electronics, and the undeniable, musk-like evidence of what had happened on the desk. We were drinking coffee again. This time, there was no lecture about bitterness or sugar. Lillian stood by the window, peering through a single slat she had twisted open, watching the city wake up below. She looked impeccable, of course. Her blouse was tucked in, her hair smoothed back into its severe, elegant style, her armor fully reassembled. But there was a difference. Her shoulders were lower. The tension that usually coiled in her spine, ready to strike, had unspooled into a relaxed, predatory grace. She wasn't guarding the gate anymore. She was resting on the battlements. I sat on the edge of the desk, the same desk, nursing the ceramic cup. The silence between us wasn't the pressurized vacuum of the boardroom, nor was it the heavy, expectant hush of the archives. It was a new frequency entirely. It was the comfortable, companionable silence of two people who have seen the worst and best of each other and decided they liked the view. There was no awkwardness, no frantic search for words to define the morning after. No shame trying to hide in the corners of the room. The daylight didn't bring regret. It brought clarity. I slid off the desk and began to gather my things. My movements were different now. Yesterday, I had moved with a frantic, apologetic energy, trying to minimize my footprint. Today, I took my time. I picked up my portfolio. I slid the tablet into my bag. I wasn't rushing to escape. I was simply preparing for the next phase. I walked to the mirror in the corner, the same one where she had touched my neck and taught me about presentation. I looked at my reflection. My suit was rumpled. There was a faint crease in the collar of my shirt. My hair, usually lacquer smooth and pinned into submission, was loose, falling in a chaotic wave over one shoulder. A day ago, this image would have sent me into a spiral of panic. I would have been scrubbing at the imperfections, terrified that a single hair out of place would disqualify me from the jagged climb to the top. Now I leaned in. I saw the darkness in my eyes, the flush that hadn't quite faded from my skin. I looked like someone who had been consumed and survived. I reached up, grabbed a pin, and half-heartedly secured a strand behind my ear. But I left the rest wild. I left the collar slightly askew. It wasn't carelessness. It was the ultimate power move. It was the visual proof that I had been here, in the inner sanctum, doing work that required more than just typing. I wasn't going to hide the evidence of my endurance. I was going to wear it. "You're leaving," Lillian said. It wasn't a question. She had turned from the window and was watching me, her expression unreadable, but her eyes warm. "The meeting is in an hour," I said, my voice steady, dropping to that lower register she had coaxed out of me. "I need to shower. I need to change." She walked over to the desk and picked up the file. The thick, heavy document that contained the strategy we had forged in the fire of the deadline. She held it out to me. She didn't smile. She didn't wish me luck. She didn't tell me to do my best. "You're ready," she said simply. It was the only validation I needed. It was heavier than the file, more valuable than the promotion itself. I took the dossier, our fingers brushing one last time. A spark, yes, but controlled now. Acknowledged. "I know," I replied. I walked to the elevator. I didn't look back to see if she was watching. I didn't need to check. I walked with the rhythm she had taught me, heel to toe, taking up space, pushing the air out of my way rather than sliding through it. I pressed the button. The doors slid open, revealing the empty car that had brought me up here a lifetime ago. I stepped in. I turned around. Lillian was standing in the center of the atrium, the gatekeeper in her domain. She nodded. Once. A salute. The doors slid shut, sealing the memory, sealing the room, and cutting off the scent of sandalwood and rain. The elevator descended, dropping 50 floors in seconds. But my stomach didn't lurch. I was grounded. I didn't get the promotion that day. The board needed a week to recover from the audacity of my proposal. But I walked out of that building with something far more dangerous than a title. I walked out knowing exactly who I was. If you know the power of closing the blinds, subscribe for more stories from the top floor.